This is Cold Start.
In our last episode, we talked about how the racing school as an entity has sort of gone away, or at least there's a lot fewer of them. They look different than they used to. And for those of us who came up through the ranks, learning from instructors or pros who had been involved with or been teaching through a racing school, it feels like a huge loss. And I was reflecting a little bit on my own experience, and having come up through a racing school, I thought it'd be worth taking a deeper dive into this specific school because there's a lot of interesting and intriguing history that led to its existence and then its eventual demise.
Yeah, I feel like racing school stories, not just of like people showing up and trying to get their competition licenses, but how they come about, how they survive, and how ultimately they potentially die, I think is really interesting. And at Sonoma Raceway, they've had a racing school here at the facility for such a long time, and it's looked different through the years. It's been called different things. It's had different names, but I think I agree with you that there's a very interesting story to tell here in how both of us have been involved. You as a participant of going through the ranks, getting a license, doing their internal racing series with the Formula 3 cars, and then myself of working at what would be the continuation of that school, and then going back through kind of the old closets, the old history books of what that place used to be and uncovering some really interesting truths.
Going through that history, we find out pretty quickly there is no authoritative or canonical source of how we got here. So a lot of this is really pieced together from our own knowledge and experience, from stories we've heard from other people, from information we're able to find and research. But it's an incomplete history. So we'd love nothing more than if you're one of the people involved in, as a student, as an instructor, administratively, somehow involved with this place, come on out and help us fill in the gaps that we might have in our story. And it starts all the way back well before either of us had any presence or involvement with any of this stuff. Back in 1973 at Sonoma Raceway, still called Sears Point International Raceway at the time, I think, Bob Bondurant, who was a well-known racer who started his own racing school, started a presence at Sonoma Raceway. And we had the Bob Bondurant School of High Performance Driving that had been present at Sonoma Raceway since 1973. Fast forward to the 90s, Skip Barber was gaining in reputation and awareness in the industry. Skip Barber took over at Sonoma from 1990 to 1995. Then in 1995, the Jim Russell Driver's School came in and took over what was formerly the Skip Barber School. And he expanded to the United States with his first presence at Sears Point Sonoma Raceway. So from 1995 until the early 2000s, they'd been involved in developing a car specifically for this racing school, along with the manufacturer Lola, who was the spec manufacturer for the FIA F3 platform, the Lola B0630 race car. So in the early 2000s, the Jim Russell School got together with the Lola folks. They developed this platform they called the FJR50, which was an F3 car with a lot of similarity to the FIA F3 official spec car, but with a little bit more allowance for larger drivers, for UK and American drivers who might not fit into the little European chassis, and with the kind of performance numbers that would light up any student. These are cars that were very capable as a student car, let alone as a race car. It could pull over 3G laterally. It had a 5-speed sequential gearbox, and it weighed all of 1,170 pounds out of a carbon fiber monocoque, which was a really advanced car, especially for a school, and even more so at that time. Part of the group that was involved with developing the Jim Russell Formula program was a fellow by the name of Paul Gerard. He's more well known as the American Stig. So when they brought the Top Gear show over to the US, it was Paul who was the Stig, the mystery driver who would put the cars to their test on the track. And he was involved in helping to create this platform along with Jim Russell, along with Lola, to wind up with the platform that eventually would become the school car. He brought in a relationship with Mitsubishi, and they landed at a platform that had a Mitsubishi 4G63 four-cylinder turbo engine, aka the same engine that appeared in the Mitsubishi Lancer Evolution 9 cars. So it's a really interesting platform where we had this proper race car, but fitted with a street car that had been tuned for racing purposes, all as a school car. So again, very capable, very high performance, much more than you would expect from a pure racing school. And then in 2009, that Mitsubishi deal sort of furthered. They brought some more Lancer Evolution cars out to the track. They finished these engine swaps and converted the entire platform of cars over to the Mitsubishi platform. Then in 2011, this new entity formed called Simraceway. And this was part of the plan for the group that had taken over just after Mitsubishi came in to build in parallel an online simulated racing platform and an in real life experience where people can come to a racing school and learn proper technique in a car at the racetrack at Sonoma Raceway. So this all started out in 2011, and they brought in a lot of really big names into this whole project. Among the early development drivers and those helping to get the physics of the cars right and help make it realistic were the late and great Dan Weldon and Dario Franchitti. So these were high-level names. These were well-established racers who were involved with helping to develop the online platform that went in conjunction with the in-person racing school that became known as Simraceway. Then later in 2014, Audi came in. A deal was struck to create the Audi sports car experience. They built a brand new building at Turn 1 right next to the raceway at Sonoma, and that became an extension of the Simraceway school offering, whereby people could come not just for high-performance driver education or their formula program, but to learn competency and capability in an Audi sports car, in an Audi road-going car. These were R8s, and we had an RS4 out there as the safety car, and Audi was a big backer of this program. The Audi program eventually wound down and was taken over by McLaren, and around the same time, the simulation platform that Simraceway had developed also was wound down. The in-person school was taking a lot more resources and time and effort. They were getting great traction. They were getting good uptake of that school, but the amount of development needed, the amount of investment needed to keep the simulated platform up and running and competitive with the other platforms that were coming out, R-Factor, Assetto Corsa, iRacing, it just wasn't to be. So they wound down the simulation platform, but continued to operate the school. The Simraceway school had over 70 vehicles in their fleet, between the vehicles they offered for programs, for arrive and drive, for support vehicles, their fleet of Polaris Razors that they had all of their instructors and support personnel zipping around at the racetrack. They had a full karting program. They fleshed this thing out in a lot of different directions: teen safe driving, autonomous driver training, all of these things where the new platforms of autonomous cars coming out needed to have a well-trained designated driver behind the wheel. And so Simraceway got into training those people. And it seemed like they were trying to do too many things. And as a member of the club taking advantage of part of those programs, I remember, along with some peers, kind of feeling like, hey, are they going to be able to sustain this? Because we really like what's here. We all kind of feel like maybe we're even underpaying a little for the value we're getting, and we're all just wanting to see this thing sustain. And unfortunately, it didn't.
Yeah, I think in 2019 it was that Simraceway finally wound down, and Sonoma Raceway actually purchased the assets of the school. So, I mean, while there was a racing school at Sonoma Raceway, the raceway itself had no involvement with any of those racing schools, basically like rented or lent the space and the track days to that organization to put on their programs. But in, I think it was late 2019, they decided to actually purchase the assets and start their own school internally run by Sonoma Raceway. That's where I became a part of the story, is when Simraceway turned into the Sears Point Racing Experience. And that was late 2019, early 2020, and the Raceway was actually running their own operations. Now, in terms of the Sears Point Racing Experience, we all know what happened in 2020 with COVID, threw a huge wrench in the whole operations, and that's a story for another time. I think this conversation is better used to talk about the interesting kind of flight path of the racing school as it was Jim Russell, then taken over by a Motive Group, still run as the Jim Russell Racing School, but by a new organization, and then how that transitioned into Simraceway. Now, Simraceway in and of itself is a very, very interesting story that we'll get into of what that platform was and what that looked like. But before we get into the Simraceway story, the Jim Russell transition, I think that was so interesting of like they were developing these kind of open wheel cars. That was their forte. Before that they got into the F3 cars, they had those like little dinky open wheel cars that had like no aero on them. Like if you've ever raced in iRacing, you know, like there's those little open wheel cars that have zero era, whether that's like
the Super V,
the Spec Racer 4 or the Super V or the Formula 1600, like that style. That's what Jim Russell was doing in the early days. And there was some pretty big names that went through the Jim Russell Racing School. I remember when I went back through the archives, like I was able to find some footage of like Scott Speed doing the Jim Russell Racing School. And that was so prevalent in the Northern California region for all these racers to get into these pro level series. And so Jim Russell had a pretty good platform there. And then as they got that relationship with Mitsubishi after they developed their Formula 3 cars, the more updated versions, it was interesting of how they originally had Cosworth engines. Because, I mean, if you think about Lola and coming from the UK, Cosworth engines, that's what would be in these things. And originally those cars had those. But then when they signed their deal with Mitsubishi and they brought in the Evolution experience and all that sort of stuff, that's when they started to engine swap the Formula 3 cars, which turned them into the very interesting cars that they are, of having those basically streetcar 4-cylinder engines with the turbos and being able to be so adaptable to, students versus full-blown race trim. It was just kind of interesting of how all that evolved.
And the Mitsubishi platform was competitive or even stronger than that predecessor Cosworth engine they put in there once they tuned it for race purposes. I think it was rated at something pushing 300 horsepower in a little 4-cylinder turbo, which at the time was a pretty good amount of power, especially when you consider 1,170 pounds of chassis.
Great power to weight ratio, and then having the adjustability of adjusting basically the wastegate of how much boost the thing was putting out of. You could have under 200 horsepower, you could have over 300. You had so much adjustability with the car, which was pretty neat. So it's rad to see that the racing school at Sonoma Raceway, even through the years from the mid-90s through the 2000s, there was always that kind of formula car focus.
Yeah, and I think part of that was something really well done by Jim Russell and others was the identity and the sort of alumni network that existed around these schools. When people would graduate from the school, they'd go on to start their racing careers or go off into club racing or do whatever it is that they were going to do. And they were very successful in attracting these individuals back to the schools later on in their careers, later on in their experience, once they've been out there doing it for a while, having experience in IMSA, in European Le Mans Series, in touring car racing, in whatever that happened to be your favorite platform or what you were trained to go do, for those individuals to come back as instructors, as sort of emissaries, if you will, of people who've been through the program, who've been out into the real world of racing and are now coming back to share those experiences with the next crop of people coming up. And the level of the instructors were truly world-class. North American and European-based instructors were sourced and brought into this school specifically to teach these programs, and in particular around the Formula 3 program. You have people who've been involved in IMSA and NASCAR and IndyCar and touring car and all these different platforms. Formula One, we had individuals involved with Formula One supporting the experience and the school that we were running. So it was done at a very high level. I think it was done with sort of an entrepreneurial approach in mind, because from the early days of the Simraceway entity, the idea was that we were going to create this platform that allowed an online simulation of this thing that we then offered in person. So it was going to be this seamless transition that we could offer of training people in this world that we were going to try to make increasingly realistic in terms of the physics and the handling of cars, the realism of the racetracks that were being scanned for the purpose of this platform, and then give people incentives on that platform to try to improve their skills such that they'd either win some prizes or be invited to the school so that they could actually try out their skills in a real car on a real racetrack. And I think that was such an innovative idea at the time. It wasn't captured fully in such a way that it still exists today and we can talk about it. There are others who have come since. I think iRacing is probably the most prominent competitor who has since lapped, if you will, what Simraceway was trying to do in terms of the scope and scale and offerings that they have on that platform. But maybe from your perspective, you can share a little bit more coming into the school when you did and kind of having an insight into that sort of combined entity. What was working well? What were the strengths of Simraceway that could have been built upon? And what were the things at odds with that or getting in the way of the core mission such that maybe it contributed to that eventual demise?
Well, everything that I experienced was just weird. Like, I was there kind of after the rubble of Simraceway and what was Jim Russell. And then there was also Jim Russell ESPN, which was kind of interesting. Basically, the way that I was able to find out about all of this information and kind of like the backdoor secrets of what was happening with the school was there was legitimate closets filled with archived photos, videos, decks, presentations, all this sort of stuff. And I never really heard of Simraceway or what that platform was. And I started doing more and more research and uncovering more things and being like, wow, this is all so fascinating. So, I mean, my perspective of, let's go back to like Simraceway and how that all got founded and what the platform was as a sim versus like the real world experience. So Simraceway, it started in 2011. Now they're branching out into the sim world because, I mean, iRacing started back in 2008. So this was kind of the mecca of people realizing that racing virtually was not only just a game, video games. There was a market for simulations and being realistic in that way and really focusing on the physics. Now, what I discovered was Simraceway, as it was created, was basically just a ripoff of R Factor. So they kind of like stole the code of another simulation and then just built their platform on top of it. And like you were saying, the very interesting thing of what kind of pulled Simraceway apart as a simulator, not as the racing school, but as a simulator, was one, they had this weird like price point or like price platform for like how you would pay for cars. It was like proportionate to like the real world value of the car. So if you wanted like a Ford Focus, that'd be like $1, but like if you wanted like a Ford GT, that'd be like $100. And then if you wanted something that was like $1 million in real life, now you're talking about multiples of hundreds of dollars. And like, which was weird. Like,
and this was to
interesting.
buy effectively what was DLC.
You would have to pay for each individual cars, just like you do in iRacing, where you have to buy the cars, you have to buy the tracks individually.
Yeah, but those cars are like a couple dollars.
They're like
$10, $12.
Yeah, 10 to 14, but they're consistent. Everything's
Right.
the same. So Simraceway, for whatever reason, had this like, if it was a cheap car in the real world, it was cheap to buy in the game. But if it was an expensive car in the real world, it was more expensive in the game. So it made no sense in that aspect. And then the other interesting thing that they did was that they would host competitions. Like you could actually win prizes and money through Simraceway competitions online. And like you were saying, one of those grand prizes was that you got to come out to Simraceway in the real world, the racing school at Sonoma Raceway, and drive cars in real life. You were essentially given like a racing school experience or a single day experience. I don't know exactly what the package was, but they were kind of like the forefront, I would say, in comparative to iRacing, of like establishing this connection between doing something online to then given an opportunity to do in the real world. And the funny thing of how I discovered about that whole thing was in the time that I was working at the Sears Point Racing Experience, for a long period of time, I was in charge of just like responding to the website if there was any sort of inquiries or questions or, anything like that. And it was like an idle Tuesday or something like that, sitting in the office. And all of a sudden I get this like random message from this person out of the country, foreign country, interesting name. I'm like, who is this? This has to be like spam or someone's just messing with the website or whatever it is. And this person like kept sending messages. And I'm like, okay, fine. I'll respond to them. Like, let's see what they want. And I forget what their name was, but they're like, hey, I was looking through the website. I'm trying to find, back from blah, blah, blah date of the championship winner. I was the championship winner and I got to come out to the track and drive, and I'm looking for photos from that. And I'm like, what? Who are you? Like, what are you looking for? I'm like, Simraceway doesn't exist anymore because at this point it was completely shut down. I'm
Right.
like, I don't know where any of that stuff is, but it kind of like sparked that interest in my mind of like, what is this person talking about? And I was able to do a little bit of research and like find some of the videos of, there was a person, a guy who had won the competition. They flew him out from another country to come to California, and he got to drive real cars on the real Sonoma Raceway.
What a cool experience that would be. And exactly the kind of model that you would think people coming up in sim racing who had an eye toward getting in a proper car, that would attract a ton of those kinds of people. It seems like that would be a really good program. So it makes you kind of stand back and say, if they were doing that kind of early on, before I'd heard of anybody else doing that, why couldn't they capitalize on that? Like, what was the issue where that model didn't turn into success for them? And The only thing I could see was, as a member of this Turn 1 club affiliated with Simraceway, was that they were involved in so many different things. There was karting, there was teen safe driving, there was teaching autonomous vehicles drivers how to have appropriate skills for those cars. There was the HPDE school for people in their street cars. There was the School of Racing for people in formula cars. They introduced the KTM crossbow experience. They were arrive and drive vehicles that you could rent for the day to use on track or out in the real world. There were the sim racing platform. And there's even more. And so you think about, how do you run a business like this? How do you need to capitalize a business like this? If you think about iRacing or other online platforms, the large producers of online platform or online titles, they're hugely funded. They're giant companies that all they do is develop software and simulations, and they do all this stuff, and that's a full entity unto itself. And here you had a small fraction of a racing school trying to do that same thing, along with a zillion other things. It was pretty clear that they were sort of diluting the value of what they were providing to any single one of those dimensions by spreading themselves too thinly and not investing a sufficient amount to continue to be able to grow and support the growth in each of those areas.
Yeah, it seemed like they were trying to specialize in too many things, and they were trying to be too cutting edge in too many areas as well. Because, yeah, I would agree with you. Like the whole model of what Simraceway was trying to do of like have the online sim racing platform with basically like online gambling competitions where you pay to race and then you could win money back if you won. I mean, imagine if iRacing had that where it's like, all right, if you want to enter into a race, it's $5, but if you win the race, you can get $100 worth of credits or $500 worth of credits depending on how many people sign up for the race. I think that's a brilliant idea, right? I mean,
that's really interesting and innovative, right? I've not seen anybody else out there doing it. I know there's regulations around online betting and gaming, but people have solved that. There's entire huge companies that are publicly traded that do this.
Yeah, and I just think like for Simraceway, they weren't specialized in creating an online platform. Like that wasn't their expertise, right? It was just a single individual with these great ideas, but didn't necessarily have the team to like back up the development. And like I said, they ripped off rFactor. It wasn't like they wrote their own code for their own simulation. They stole someone else's and then tried to build on that platform. And it was kind of neat of watching them use real world racers and real world cars to help tune the code of the physics of how the tires would come up to temp, what the grip felt like, all that sort of stuff. Like that was really, really interesting and really cool. And I mean, they had that access, right? As a racing school with the cars, with the drivers and the track, they could basically like simulate Sonoma Raceway and then do laps on track and then do laps on the sim and compare, which was really cool. But yeah, like it was interesting also what they did. Like I also found in the closet was one of the original Simraceway gaming controllers, and I still have it.
Oh, the wheel.
The wheel, which, yes, we think about sim wheels of like they're attached to a hub that you attach to the desk. No, this was just a wheel. Like it didn't attach to anything. And so you would have this like free-floating wheel that you would hold on to that would sync up to the Simraceway game, and you would just turn the wheel and it would turn the car. Kind of like if you think about like Wii, like the Wii Nintendo, where you had the little controller and you turned it and it would turn the game or turn in Mario Kart. It was the same thing, but it was like a formula style wheel. It was so interesting of how they went about it.
That's really interesting. That's really weird too, right? Because you think about how a formula wheel operates, how any steering wheel operates, and there's a fixed point in the middle, right? You're turning around this point. So now when you get rid of that and you're just rotating this object freely in space, there's no resistance to work against. There's no
force feedback.
Right, there's nothing. So it seems like, how could you go about this? And I think it goes in line with, look, there is great ambition behind a lot of these ideas. And I don't want to kill that. Like I love when people come out with grandiose ideas and they try to pull them off, but they have to be built in such a way and structured so they can be realistically pulled off. And I think here we had a lot of aspirational development going on where we're building things where we didn't yet have the full picture in mind of how we're going to make it work, but we'll go ahead and do that and pave the road out a little bit ahead of where we are just to enable us to continue to operate. At some point, we'll figure it out. Large internet businesses have figured this out where they started out, they didn't have a business model. They stuck around for a few years long enough to be successful to the point where they discovered how they could make money. and they could actually scale their business, and they continue on that way. Well, with Simraceway, I think they kept trying different things, and they didn't pay close enough attention to what was their bread and butter. What was paying the bills? What was actually growing their business? They were really attracted by the shiny object, whatever squirrel ran by, they kind of chased after. And once the school was gone, I read an article that was sort of trying to piece together how we got there and all those things. They described how the school came about, and they said in 2006, Simraceway was founded as a driving simulator business. It doesn't mention at all the fact that they were trying to start a racing school. So you kind of wonder, well, was that an afterthought? Did they attach the simulator business to a school because they said, hey, that would be interesting? And the founder of that business was billed as, quote, an entrepreneur leveraging skill quantification to improve online multiplayer gaming. So this individual theoretically had a background in quantification of humans in a way, or quantification of actions, such that you could then translate those into a simulated environment and make that into a gaming environment. As far as I know, that individual didn't have any computer background, development background, physics background, or anything in those areas. I think he did drive a Formula 3 car coming up in the FIA British Masters or something like that. But it kind of makes you wonder, what is the additional gap there? What is the thing that's lacking in coming in with this idea that we're just going to turn skills into an online simulation of reality and that we can make that work without ever having done that before? And the reality of what it takes to actually operate a car at speed under high dynamics on the racetrack. There's sort of a big gap in between. You kind of wonder like how that gap would be filled or with whom that gap would be filled. And by and large, it looked like it was mostly racing drivers who were employed to try to develop the physics of the race car in the simulated world, but not with this entire team of engineers and aerodynamicists and people that you would have go really deep on this stuff if you were building an entire platform at scale as a company where this was your first and primary mission.
Well, I mean, they had a pretty small team. I mean, it seemed like it was a pretty much a bootstrap operation of like
totally
doing what you can. And I just found it so interesting of like how much was going after like, okay, this is something new and something different and all that sort of stuff. But like not just in one category, but in like multiple categories. And one of the other things that I saw that got carried over once Simraceway kind of closed its doors and then it was the Sears Point racing experience, what Sonoma Raceway inherited was a fleet of the KTM Expos. And so Simraceway, Jim Russell, they had a relationship with different manufacturers throughout their years. In the beginning, it was the Mitsubishis. Then it was the Audi sports car experience, which that was a cool story. The Audi sports car experience was the origination of the Audi R8, and they wanted to sell a bunch of Audi R8s in Northern California, and they basically wanted to meet this like quota of how many cars they could sell on the West Coast. And then as soon as they met that quota, they're like, cool, we're done here. We don't need to do anything more. And they disappeared and became McLaren. But then kind of, I feel like maybe the final nail in the Simraceway coffin was like they invested all of this money to buy KTM Expos. And like, if you don't know what a KTM Expo, KTM Crossbow, whatever you want to call them, KTM as an entity, as a company, is known for their motorcycles.
They're dirt bikes.
Two-wheel division. These are four-wheel, right? They're cars, track cars. They're kind of like track day cars is the best way I could describe them. But they're open cockpit, closed fendered. They're powered by Audis. So it's an Audi engine, Audi transmission, manual, and there was also the DSG, which is a Volkswagen Group product. And they had those for their kind of like experiences. And these things didn't have ABS, didn't have traction control, and they're going to be their like introductory single day like experience car. And it's like, that's a lot for someone to like jump into for like a single day experience.
Well, when you have the Formula 3 platform as your introductory Formula car experience, you could imagine they were shooting for the moon, right? And they were aiming for a really high level whereby it wasn't all that unusual for somebody to have a crash or do something wrong in the car. And that's part of the learning experience, but that's also part of having a very high overhead repair intensive business.
Yeah, you typically want cars for racing school that are easy to repair and also not that easy to break, right? Like you want cars that aren't complicated. And I would agree with you, like a Formula 3 car is an introductory Formula car, like, oof, like that's a pretty big step up. I mean, we look back on the old Jim Russell's late 90s, early 2000s Formula cars, and you're like, that looks like a beginner car. Like, that doesn't look too fast, and it's on bicycle tires. You know, you'll be able to learn everything you need to know. Where for Sim Raceway, they just had these like kind of gnarly cars. And then the KTM Crossbow Expo, they're also based in Austria. So like all of the support when these cars would break and when they would go down, you would have to ship parts from Austria. Like, so once again, they wanted to be cutting edge, the only people in North America to have these cars, ooh, cool, shiny, but like all these Americans didn't know what the hell that they were. And even when I was working there and we had these cars and we were running programs with them, there was a period of time that like they randomly started bricking themselves. And at this point, we had gotten rid of all the manual transmission cars. Everything was paddle shift, automatic.
Yeah, I remember they were all converted over.
That was a little bit more user-friendly, but like now also you have these cars that were like modified. Like the transmissions were swapped out in these vehicles. And we had this like span where like the cars would legitimately brick themselves. It was some electronical coding problem. And it was a thing that we were contacting Austria, and they're like, yeah, we have no idea. Like, we can ship someone out to you to like potentially look at them to see what's going on, but like we have no idea because this is the largest fleet of these cars in existence, and they're in North America on the West Coast in California. So they're like, yeah, we've never seen this problem before. And so like there was a period of time where it's like weeks and weeks on end, you just had like 3 or 4 cars that like couldn't even operate. And so like for Sim Raceway, once again, trying to be on the cutting edge in so many different ways, they basically just started tripping themselves up and not really focusing, like you were talking about, on the bread and butter stuff of like, just put on programs and fill programs. It doesn't need to be this like, ooh la la, look at me type of stuff. Just get stuff that works and is easy to work on. And like even the Formula 3 cars to an extent were bizarre. Like there was nothing else like them anywhere else. Like they were produced by Lola just for Jim Russell. And so like you kind of had to have the parts you had.
Yeah, it's important to realize in order to operate a school like this, where there's all these programs and they have a fleet of cars, you need support personnel, you need mechanics, you need techs, you need people who can operate and repair and make sense out of the cars that you're using for your school and your programs, because that's your bread and butter. Again, that's the main resource you have to offer to people other than knowledge is the vehicle. And the Jim Russell School had created a program which was pretty innovative at the time, and Sim Raceway carried forward, called the Mechanics Training Program. And it was a cool opportunity for people who wanted to learn the trade of race mechanics to be able to come in and do a school intensive alongside the running programs that Sim Raceway had in order to work on the cars that were being used as part of the school. And so there was an ecosystem there. We have these cars. They're being used by multiple programs in our school. They have a certain lifespan. They have a certain life cycle. They have a certain maintenance regime that they need. And we can bring people in, train them on that platform, and then potentially even hire them on within the school as a mechanic or send them out into industry, and they can be a race mechanic trained on a proper race car platform. Well, when that started out as the Lola-based Formula Jim Russell 50 with the Mitsubishi Evo engine in it, those were things people could see out in the real world. You would go work on a Formula car that had open wheels, that ran on slicks, that had the architecture like that car had. You could go touch cars that ran this specific engine, that had this kind of tuning, that dealt with these kinds of issues like you'd have with turbos and wastegates or cooling and exhaust and all of these things that were part of the mechanics of dealing with these cars and being able to provide them to students for their use. You needed the mechanics. And so having this mechanics training program was such a cool analog, because you were basically cultivating the ground ahead of you to the point where you were growing more mechanics who potentially could learn about and work on the platform that is important to your school, that is the car that you're offering to people to come and learn how to drive. And there was this nice 360-degree view that you had there. But while I was just starting out with the school and ramping up into the Turn 1 Club, I asked about the mechanics training program. I didn't think I was a very good candidate to go into the full program. I wasn't really looking to gain employment as a mechanic, but I really wanted to have the know-how. I really wanted to learn how to turn a wrench and what made these cars go and how to operate them and how to do a brake swap or some kind of basic operations that would make me feel somehow more able or adequate or in tune with the car that I'm trying to drive out on track. And unfortunately, Sim Raceway didn't see the future value in that program, didn't invest in it further. And as soon as I had joined, the MTPs effectively went away, even though the need for mechanics remained or even increased with the kinds of programs that the school Simraceway was running.
Yeah, I think, once again, another great idea that they had at the school here was a school for mechanics. And with that, they created their own ecosystem, right? I mean, you fulfilled all elements of, yeah, you need people to work on the cars, might as well teach them how to work on race cars and be able to connect them with the motorsport industry after they graduate the school to then go on and be a mechanic for a major race team or a major racing organization. You know, it can be a school on both ends. And I think that was Jim Russell was brilliant in adding that to their operations because, yeah, absolutely. Like, where else do you go to become a motorsport mechanic other than like just become an apprentice for their team and like hope you can figure it out? Like, there kind of nowadays, to my knowledge, isn't like a dedicated school for that. And I feel like Simraceway, in a sense, like had a lot of really good ideas. Like the sim in the way that it was formatted with competition and the ability to then get into real world cars, I think that was a really cool idea. The mechanics program, I think that's a really cool idea. Now, I agree with you. I think they just kind of grasp at too many things all at once, and that was kind of their crumble. Now, with that, I think it'd be a fun conversation for us to have now of like, all right, how would you kind of moving forward? We talked about the death of racing schools in general. We talked about this weird story of Simraceway and how it was a sim, which sucked, but was kind of cool. People still talk about it. You can still Google sim racing on the internet and find like YouTube videos and stuff like that of people like were actually kind of into it. Like, it had its community for a period of time. But with all of these things, how would you create your own racing school? What would be some of those elements? What would be things that you would implement that you aren't seeing racing schools implement now and what you saw Simraceway kind of screw up?
First and foremost, that ecosystem is essential. There's a set of things that you need working all together in concert in order to have a good racing school. You need good instructions and good materials to instruct, right? So there's got to be materials developed in advance of people coming to teach. So you need a philosophy, sort of a mindset, a methodology. Then you also need a facility. You have to be somewhere. And a lot of racing schools operate without a headquarters. They just move from place to place and they take their trailer and their instructors. And it's like a traveling road show, but it's really high overhead. All the transport, all of the logistics, the time and materials and entertainment and meals and all that kind of stuff of getting people from place to place, it adds up fast. It's really hard to scale. So having the facility, I think, is really key. And having that at a racetrack where people want to drive, and it's a good racetrack for learning to drive and learning dynamics, they had all that nailed, being at Sonoma, being there right at turn one. What a perfect location that was. One of the things I thought they started to do really well in seeing this mechanics program exist alongside the club racing that they created, I'd participate in their Formula 3 club racing series, which was not open only to their students. It was open to anybody else who could demonstrate competency in an open wheel Formula 3 platform. But you worked alongside those mechanics in pit lane. You got to know them. They were part of the team. They were part of the club. They were part of what made this whole thing work and kept us safe out on track, and then put things back together in a hurry to get us back out on track when we made a mistake. So having that tight coupling of the mechanics and the race program and people getting to know each other, I think, was really essential. And then you're graduating people out. You're giving people an opportunity to continue to race and get experience within the school itself through this club. But then people wanted to go and explore or graduate to the next level. I know that's where I was. I got good at Formula 3 in this platform at this location. I wanted to expand my skills and try to do that on another level. And so the jumping off point was something that at the time, Simraceway was just starting to look at how to consult with their students and how to offer a path for their students to make that jump from local club racing to regional or national or international level competition. And Simraceway undertook a few different efforts to try to get their students facile, skilled, able, and capable enough so that they could go drop them into another proper race car and put them in a series and go be capable and credible. And wouldn't that look great for your school? Wouldn't that look amazing for your program if you can say Simraceway graduate Bob is here now racing in IMSA, is in the GT4 class, is out there being plausible as a racer. And, it looks great for our school to have people out there graduating. They started to do this. I had a few Turn 1 Club peer members, colleagues, racing school fellow students who had gone on into touring car racing, who who had gone into prototype racing, GT racing. And so I had friends that were off at IMSA, off at Le Mans Cup, off at ELMS. We're out there doing it at a high level. And we were able to draw the line from, or we were able to connect the dots from the beginnings of learning how to race a car or drive a car properly on a racetrack through to learning how to be part of a club racing organization, mastering a platform, learning the dynamics of competition, learning wheel-to-wheel racing, then stepping up and moving on from that. And at one point, Simraceway went out and acquired an LMP3 car. And they were campaigning an LMP3 car, part of the IMSA overall programs each weekend where they'd have the IMSA Sports Car Championship. Part of that was the Prototype Challenge. Part of that was overlap where there was multi-class competition with LMP3 and GT cars. And it was so exciting to be able to go to a race affiliated with the school and see your friends and colleagues get out of there in the car. And the car was branded as Simraceway, and the co-driver in the car was one of the instructors at Simraceway. And to have that whole program and to have that culminate into now you're actually out in the world racing as a result of your experience at this racing school. I think that was an amazing part of and could have provided continuity to the school in a way that they were lacking. However, at this point in time, the school was so spread thin into so many different areas. At this point in time, autonomous driving started to become a real thing. Google, via Waymo, and a few other companies started to develop these vehicles where they had to have a designated driver sit behind the wheel so that they could take over in the case of an emergency and know how to deal with important techniques to drive those cars. Those companies would be responsible for the people driving in those cars or riding in those cars along with their drivers. So they decided they would cater to this burgeoning area in driver training, and they spun up a program around it. Well, if you think about it, how many total companies are in autonomous driving? How many total drivers and cars would they even have? It's a pretty quick to saturate market. And yet Simraceway at the time was exploring maybe they should take on additional facilities in other locations or old proving grounds for manufacturers so that they can create the kind of environment that the autonomous vehicle operators and manufacturers would need for their worlds. I mean, this is really diluting the model of we're now a racing school teaching people competency and how to drive a car on track to the point where now we're reaching out to tech companies to try to be part of their autonomous driving education programs and training for their company. It just was too far afield from the core mission. And I think seeing that on-ramp to proper racing was exactly the right direction, but they couldn't capitalize on it. They didn't have the right financial models behind it. They weren't charging the right amount of money. They didn't have enough backing to draw from, to borrow from, whatever it was that they needed to do to help scale that program. And I remember one day standing out in pit lane with some of my racing colleagues and the owner of this school and having a conversation about what a great thing we have and how we feel like there's so much more value even than what we're paying. Like literally, a bunch of guys stood around and told this guy how he could charge us more money than he was charging, and we'd be willing to pay it because this is something that was so good we wanted to see it continue to exist. And even with that, he couldn't figure out how to turn the corner and make that into a successful business because his attention was too diluted into other areas. So my advice would be, pick a few areas where you're going to focus your efforts. Make sure they're complementary to one another. Make sure you're making good use of the resources you have, your people, your cars, the facility, the racetrack, making sure you're using it all to high capacity, that you can scale and train people in such a way that they can be replaceable for one another. If person A can't be there, person B can stand in and do just as fine a job as person A. All of those were aspects that were sort of lacking in the latter days as Simraceway and unfortunately caused its downfall. And I think things that could have been done differently to enable its success. I love the idea of the simulation platform, the iRacing platform, but I think it was too far afield from the core model of teaching people to drive on track, having a fleet of vehicles that required mechanical support. The online platform didn't need any of that. None of those people were useful in the world of running cars in meat space on the racetrack. So I think that's another thing that you need to get right, which is have all your resources devoted to the same kinds of things in the same places so that they can play one another's roles as needed and ultimately have a more flexible business that you can continue to build on your core model without getting too diluted into other things that are just going to distract from that core business.
Now, if I was king for a day and I made my own racing school, I think one of the most important things, and I would agree with you, definitely have a permanent location. Make people travel to you. Make your thing so special that people want to get on a plane and travel. Make sure you pick a good racetrack, that it's challenging enough, and it serves the purpose that you want to do, and it has good infrastructure around it as well, that people are going to enjoy this vacation on top of just coming to your racing school. Now, I would also strongly emphasize that you have a relationship with the manufacturer, because one of your biggest costs is going to be cars, running cars, tires, things like that, day-to-day operation stuff. And if you can create a really good relationship with a manufacturer that's like, hey, we really want to push this new model, we want to get in the sports space, we want people to look at this brand and think they're sporty. Hyundai is a great example of this, of like, what did you think about Hyundai like 10 years ago? Oh, it's just a cheap Econo box, like boring car. They spent a lot of money in motorsports to make their N program be like, no, those things are actually pretty sporty. They're cool. They can win on the racetrack, all that sort of stuff. So team up with the manufacturer that's looking to get into that space so you can have consistent cars, you have consistent support, get a tire sponsor that covers those expenses, that you can have consistent supply in inventory of tires. Now, the place that I would lean a little bit more than I've seen other racing schools, and it's kind of interesting that other racing schools haven't picked up on this a little bit more, I would lean into the simulators a little bit more. Because, like, if you want to cut costs, think about, like, the time that you spend just in the paddock trying to go over simple things, or, like, breaking downshift techniques, stuff like that, like, could potentially damage cars significantly, especially in like those formula cars. You would spend hours braking and downshift. And yes, I understand that a simulator's not perfectly going to simulate that, but you can really easily talk about the techniques. Where do those eyes need to go? Stuff like that without damaging vehicles. And even like a track introduction. It's on the simulator. Like here at Sonoma Raceway, I always thought, like, as the racing school, why don't we have 5 simulators? And before, we go on the actual big track, all right, everyone jump on the sim. You're going to have some instructors walking around, watching your laps. Let's talk about the line. Move the car here. Get familiar with some of those visuals that are going to be out there, where to brake, where to turn in. You can talk about all that stuff while someone's on a simulator, and it's not overwhelming. They're not in this car. They're not feeling the G-forces yet. And you can talk through kind of gradually and about the basics. And then let's get out on the track. So at that point, now as a racing school, we're saving money. We're saving the potential of vehicles getting damaged if we're going over downshift techniques, line techniques, whatever it is. But I would say, yes, definitely don't take away from like the real world experience, because that's its own separate thing. But like implementation, I'm surprised that more racing schools aren't doing that with simulators.
100%. And simulators have come a long way since, 2006 or whatever it was. And they were trying to develop this for the first time. But simulator as a tool for teaching, amazing, underused, undervalued. 100% agree with that. I think having a room full of sims that, the first couple of hours of day one is sitting in the sim, getting to know what the racetrack is, knowing whether to make a left or a right, where to look, where to have your eyes, learning basic technique. I think there's the most common failure we see with people who are brand new to the racetrack is the cold tires problem, where you go out on track and you're used to driving in the street where you don't have to warm up your tires or even think about the temperature of them, because the aggregate in a road is such that it's very mechanically grippy, and the conditions that you're driving in, they're designed for the fact that you're driving on these kind of tires. Well, at the racetrack, for performance driving, they demand that you have heat in your tires for them to grip. And so many new drivers don't get this right or aren't patient enough such that they go out on their outlap or their second lap, they push too hard, and they spin or they crash because their tires didn't have enough heat to give them grip. And the simulator does an even too good job of showing that effect where your first lap out, your second lap out, they're kind of frustrating. They're kind of hard to drive. You're like, I know how to drive a car. How come I can't even keep it on the pavement? Well, that's a realistic version of what it's like being on cold, slick tires on a racetrack without getting heat into them. And what a great way to save people the ego bruising, the expense, the having to spend time to repair a bunch of vehicles, where we can just show people on the sim, hey, look, it's harder than it looks. You need to be patient, take a couple laps. Now let's get in the car where we've already reinforced that with you versus your first time out, whoops, I'm in the wall before I'm even out of pit lane because I didn't listen.
Yeah, 100%. And the final element that I would add to my racing schools is what used to be in racing schools a bunch which is scholarship programs, putting on events within the school and being like, if you can win this shootout, we're going to be able to give you X amount of thousands of dollars to be able to go into a pro series. Like that used to exist back in the Jim Russell days. And that's how these names got into professional racing and were able to make careers out of being professional race car drivers. And nowadays, I really don't see that anymore. And I would love to see more scholarship programs. I think iRacing has been doing a pretty okay job of it, but like there can be more of it, right? Of whether that's on sim racing, scholarships to get into a real car, or if you're going to a racing school and doing a little bit of a series or whatever it is, or a racing school just putting on a shootout. Hey, come out. If you think you're the shit, come out to this weekend, drive these cars, whoever's going to win or put down the fastest time or whatever it is, you're going to get a scholarship to go and race something professionally. Like maybe not like top of the line professional, but like a weekend or some event or something like that. Like help bridge the gap between a school, track days, and getting into club racing as well as professional racing. Like help establish that connection again. Don't make it the haves and the have-nots. Like the schools back in the day were always that avenue for people to like, if you just put in the time and the effort, you can make that happen.
One other thing, though, that I think that's developed that would really help a lot is the media presence and that media platform. When you go to an iRacing race, you can watch it. You can see other people doing it. In fact, you'll sometimes see full broadcasts with color commentary and on-screen graphics and all this stuff to make a true sporting event out of a simulated race, especially the ones with high stakes. So now imagine if your club racing event at the school, maybe with the scholarship program involved or not, they do a little bit more of the video thing. Instead of just putting a GoPro on every car, we do a YouTube broadcast. We get some commentators. We treat it like it's a proper race. And okay, the level of racecraft, the level of capability that we're going to see isn't going to be at the level of an IMSA race or a professional race car, driver behind the wheel. But it's still entertaining. I mean, people still go watch Ferrari Challenge because you get to see a bunch of Ferraris out there on track driving fast, and maybe they'll crash. Watching newer people learning to drive a car up and coming on the racetrack, there's going to be a lot of room for things that are unpredictable, for things that you didn't expect to happen. What a fun thing to watch. And then who knows who you're watching and where they might go somewhere later in their career. You were there watching somebody when they were just cutting their teeth, learning to do a thing, and then a few years later, you get to watch them on a proper professional motorsports broadcast, them out there doing it in the car. So I think that's one other aspect is giving people something to take away from the experience, to show or share with their friends, to say, hey, here's me, I'm out there doing it, and doing that in a format that people are used to, I think through video or, social media would go a long way.
Yeah, and all that stuff is cheaper nowadays, like you're talking about, with simulators being better at being sims. It's also cheaper to have cameras and drones and put on a live broadcast through Discord or Twitch or YouTube or whatever it is. And I just wish that more people, like you're saying, lean into that. Because I think, if you put it on and you televise it and you market it and you put it out there, it'll put more emphasis on it. Like the only reason why a racing series, it feels professional on the professional level is because it's televised or it's posted somewhere. Or there's the happenstance that gets put onto it, because realistically, the racing at a club race weekend might even be better than some IMSA races or the lower levels or whatever it is, but those ones just don't have the broadcasting connections to put it on TV.
Yeah, it's something that could really heighten that experience to make it something that feels even more special than it might otherwise. And I think that's something you want to leave people with, is that feeling of being excited, being motivated, being in a mode where they want to share with their friends and their family and get them affected by this bug of motorsports the same way that they've been affected. And I think those are all required for us to see a model where we can take a racing school as we're used to and somehow modify it or pivot it in some way that could be successful in today's market. And we see so few people out there doing that successfully. We got to try something different. I mean, if not what we've done before, try something we haven't done before.
Yeah, I really feel like there's an opportunity in the marketplace. It's been fun to look back on the Simraceway story, because I think it is so interesting, of this school that existed at Sonoma Raceway for so long under different names with different manufacturers, the whole connection between sim racing and a real racing school, which I think at the end of the other episode of talking about racing schools dying, I brought that up of why doesn't iRacing have a racing school? I mean, It didn't work back in the mid 2010s, but I feel like they have a pretty good shot of it working in the 2020s.
Yeah, pour one out for Simraceway, but know that that's an idea where there's potential for things that can come and replace it and maybe be an offering that we didn't even think of before that can give a lot more people experience and exposure to motorsports and to get on board with this thing that we love so much and participate in it with us.
And hey, do you think I could connect my Simraceway race wheel? Do you think that that would still work?
I'm sure it would do something. And maybe if nothing else, you could try it with Wii Sports.
Modify it. Well, this has been fun. Thanks, Todd.
Thanks, Alice.
And thanks for listening. This has been Cold Start.